So I just have one last thing to say about leaves, and then we're going to get into kind of the next section of this class, which is looking at the different phyla of organisms and plants, although I actually start with fungi. So it's tradition that you cover fungi in a botany class. And I have a lot to say about fungi in terms of applied uses of fungi. So fungi and algae are what we're going to start in a minute here. In lab, you're going to have some fun with fungi, growing the fungi, and you can choose to eat them if you want. You don't have to, but hopefully you'll be encouraged to do so after you learn a little bit more about them. And then we'll be working with algae as well tomorrow. And so there'll be some lab handouts, or, things posted in EduCat with Dr. Chu's EduCat. So make sure that you look those over before you walk in. And so we'll be doing several different things tomorrow in lab. All right. Okay. Well, this is a weird image. Thinking about leaves. Now we're thinking like the leaf. When you look at a leaf, it's the leaf blade, the flat part that is busy doing photosynthesis, and then it has its own stem. And so the fancy name for that, the leaf stem, is the petiole. Petiole is the fancy name for the leaf stem. So that's what we're looking at right now, at least part of it. And so you need to think about that when you're out hiking around now in the fall with the beautiful fall color change. What you're going to see happening, well, you won't see it unless you have a microscope handy, but this is the base of the petiole where it attaches to the main branch of the tree. And I think you can clearly see this zone here, this line of cells that look very different. And so that is called the abscission zone. And the abscission zone. So this is a line of cells that are weakening. The cell walls are starting to weaken. So what's happening now with the beautiful fall color change is that, the big picture idea is that you have a lot of nutrients in the leaf that shouldn't go to waste. So it doesn't make sense if you're a plant to drop your leaves while you still have all that nutrition in your leaves. So right now they're busy siphoning that, so to speak. They're getting those nutrients out of the leaf and down into the roots, primarily for winter storage. And then you start seeing the beautiful fall color shift from green to reds, and purples, and yellows, and gold. And then as all that is happening, you get this abscission zone, this weakening layer of cells, and then eventually that weakens so much that the leaves fall off the tree. All right, so this is programmed into the plant. Okay, they're doing this on purpose. They want to eventually drop their leaves, but they don't do that until after they've kind of gotten everything out of there that's of use, get it down into the roots for storage. So the parenchyma cells down in the roots are busy storing up a lot of nutrients over winter. Okay. So now deciduous plants, the conifers around here, the red pine, the white pine, and so on, those leaves stay long term, but I'm sure if you think about it for a minute, when you've been out hiking around, you do see brown needles on the forest floor. So they do drop. They just don't tend to drop all at once unless something's really wrong. So that's why they say, oh, they're evergreen. They're non-deciduous. It's because they just don't all go brown and drop. All right. So, but they are busy renewing their needles. They just do it a lot slower, and they only do a certain percentage per year. Okay. All right. So that's the last thing I wanted to say about leaves. And we're going to get now into the next slide set, which is posted in EduCat on fungi and algae. Now, I broke it up into two parts, part 1 and part 2. So part 1, you're going to get like the basic idea of what are fungi and algae. Part 2 is going to be more of the applied wide uses that, what do we use these for in commercial production? So kingdom fungi have their own separate kingdom. They used to think that they were plants, and so that's why it's tradition for botany classes to include them. But like I said way back on, I think the first day, I love fungi, so I'm going to include them no matter what. So algae, we're going to look at them as well. So they are in their own separate kingdom. Kingdom protista, or some people say kingdom protoctista, depends who you talk to. Either one I'm fine with. And then, of course, plants have their own separate kingdom. They're in kingdom plantae. All right. So when we look at fungi and algae, they have, well, algae in particular, we're going to look at carefully in the sense of we think like the terrestrial plants are, the algae were like the precursors. They evolved, the plants evolved from algae. But let's get into the fungi first. So you're seeing here some different growth morphologies of fungi. And so here on the top left images, you're seeing how they can grow in, often they're described as hair-like or filamentous. Filamentous is usually the more proper way to talk about it. Filamentous growth, but it's like these long, skinny strands. And they're referred to as hyphae. Right? And so A-E on the end of the word makes it plural. If you take off the E, then it's singular. So we say, oh, look at all the hyphae growing. Okay, this is under the microscope what they would look like. And so you can see that you've probably noticed that if you've seen, you can even see fungal hyphae like growing through your bread. If your bread spoils, sometimes you see that. Or you might see it growing on the surface of an orange, that green fuzz. Top right, you see a mushroom. We'll talk more about mushrooms. That's their way of dispersing their spores when their spores are ready to go. The bottom two images are looking at a different way that some fungi can grow. This is more unicellular cells. So these are just individual cells that you're looking at under the microscope, that lower left image. And so very different than the hyphal growth pattern. All right, they're just unicellular cells. If you grow those type of fungi on an agar plate, so agar plates have growth media inside them. So this is like gelatin, essentially. It's agar that has thickened up, and you mix in some nutrients that fungi love, and they'll grow on it. And so that's how they would look if you grow them on the surface of an agar plate. So they can look very different from each other, but they all belong in the kingdom fungi, and they all have some similarities that we can say in general. All fungi do this. So this is the list of all fungi do this. All right, so they're non-photosynthetic. They cannot do photosynthesis like plants can do. All of their cell walls, no matter what their form, they have what is called chitin. And if you know a little bit about insects, insects have chitin in their exoskeleton. And so it's kind of interesting that fungi have chitin and insects have chitin as part of their ways to have some nice structural support. Okay. And then what else can we say about them? They propagate by spores, so they don't form any kind of seed like we talk about, like with the flowering plant. They have spores that they use, and the spores can be through sexual reproduction. They can make spores, or they might just do it through asexual. So each spore is basically a clone, has the same exact genetic material as the fungus who produced it. So sexual and asexual. Again, here are some really beautiful images. This top right one is of the fungus Penicillium. That's the genus name. So penicillin, the antibiotic penicillin we get from penicillium. And it has some very unique structures when you look at it under the microscope. So that's kind of if I see that under the microscope, I know I'm dealing with penicillium. And then here you can see on the bottom, the left and middle images, that's how hyphae look when they're growing. A little up close, you can see that kind of fuzzy look to it. And then those black dots are spores that are being produced. And then this far right image is unicellular fungi, which we usually refer to as yeast. Okay, so yeast grow in that unicellular morphology, kind of looking egg-shaped. And we use the yeast in many different ways, which we'll mention a few in a little while here. But they are extremely useful in research purposes too, because they can be genetically modified and manipulated, and you can, so they're often used for drug production, for example. And so yeast, and they're easy to work with in the lab. You can grow trillions of yeast in a very small footprint of physical space. So kind of nice to work with them in that regard. If they have this hyphal growth form or the filamentous growth form, they're often nicknamed molds. People will say, oh, look at the mold growing on the shower curtain or something like that. All right. And so mold tends to have a negative connotation. So it's not my favorite word. I tend to refer to fungi as filamentous or the hyphal growth pattern. So, okay, what else do they have that are similar? They don't have any kind of mouth to eat food. So what they do is they secrete out enzymes that they've made, and they use, so those enzymes get excreted out, and they start breaking down more complex molecules into smaller bits and pieces that then the fungus can absorb into their body, so to speak. Right? The hyphae, again, they're long filaments of growth, and they can be branched or unbranched depending on where you're looking. They can be extensive, like miles upon miles of fungal hyphae are. And when you're walking across campus, you walk across the grass, there's thousands of miles of hyphae under your feet. So it can be quite extensive. The chitin, again, you don't need to know the fancy details, but if you're interested, it's a polysaccharide. So it's a sugar-based molecule, but it's been modified. And what I thought was really interesting is, you know, equal weight of chitin versus steel, it's stronger than steel. So there's been a lot of interest in chitin, whether it's from an insect exoskeleton or the fungal cell wall, because of its strength. It's pretty interesting part of it. And then it has, all fungi seem to have ergosterol, which is related to cholesterol, which is what we have. But it's unique to them. Okay, so they have their own version of cholesterol, which is called ergosterol. So if you took a soil sample or some kind of environmental sample and you like, hey, there's a bunch of ergosterol in this sample, you know fungi were there at some point. Okay, so they actually use that as an identification of if there's fungi present or not. They can look for ergosterol. So cholesterol for us, it actually helps with our cell membranes. It kind of gives some nice support to our cell membranes when we have the right balance of that. And it's the same for the fungi. They use it in their cell membrane. Okay, what else can we say? Let's see. Well, okay, here's a picture showing kind of the anatomy of the filamentous growth on the left. So by the way, if you have a bunch of hyphae all clustered together, sometimes they'll use the word mycelium. They'll say, oh, look at that big patch of, hyphae. Oh, and then they'll say it's mycelium. I don't use that word that much, but you will see that. I tend to say hyphae. And then just on the right, if any of you are into chemistry, there's chitin. I'm not going to quiz you on that. As long as you know that chitin is part of the cell wall, but I'm not going to get into the chemical details. Here's a really cool picture of yeast. So this is under a very powerful microscope. You can see that unicellular yeast and all these patches on the yeast cell. That's previous buds of like the progeny yeast. So when they go through reproduction, we call it budding. They bud off like little baby yeast cells, and they're smaller like this. and then they'll break free of the mother yeast, so to speak. They actually use those terms. And then that yeast will get bigger physically to the adult size. And so they're really kind of fun to look at under the microscope. And they have this very fun budding behavior when they go through reproduction. So the classic, most well-studied yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is used in the beer brewing industry, winemaking industry, and heavy use in research. This one, they know more about this yeast than probably any other yeast on the face of the earth. It's been really well studied, and a lot of manipulation being done on it. So lots and lots of uses for Saccharomyces, billion-dollar uses for this yeast. And you can buy it from the store. If you go and buy brewer's yeast or baker's yeast, that's what you're buying. You're buying Saccharomyces. And it looks like if I go to buy bread yeast, and it just looks like a bunch of dry granules in that jar, those are living. Like when I want to grow up yeast in the lab, I go and buy yeast for bread baking, and I just sprinkle some of that onto some agar media, and they start to grow. And so they're living. They have an expiration date. Eventually they'll die off, but they stay good in that jar for quite some time. This is another yeast that's quite famous, Candida albicans. This is a yeast that's common on human skin, and it can be just hanging out with us, no problem, but it can also cause problems. So we say it's an opportunist. So it can make you sick. Yeast infections are probably one of the main things that it can do. Thrush, it can cause thrush, if you've ever heard of that. And so it also has a weird capability of morphing into that hyphal growth form or that mycelial growth form. So usually it's a yeast-like unicellular organism, but it has this ability to morph and change its shape when it becomes, especially an opportunistic pathogen. It tends to change its appearance. So it's kind of a funky yeast in that regard, kind of a chameleon in that regard. Okay, so we have the filamentous type fungi that form those hyphae. Then we have the unicellular type fungi that we often refer to as yeast. So with the filamentous type here, you're just seeing some variations on how they can grow and how their hyphae look. So here you're seeing that sometimes the hyphae have these cross walls. They're not totally solid. There's like little pores in those walls. So you can still have flow of cytoplasm and nutrients, but the fancy word for that is septate. You don't need to know that. Just know that sometimes, depending on the fungus, you might have some walls, they're called cross walls, but you might not. All right, it just depends. This middle one there's no cross walls. And so the cytoplasm just freely floats around inside those big long filaments, no problem. And then sometimes you'll have funky looking pseudohyphae where it's yeast tend to do this. They morph into that pseudohyphae. So I'm putting this here mainly just to show you some diversity in how they grow and their morphology. And again, under the microscope, you might see some really quite ornate structures. This is penicillium again. And then sometimes you just see a bunch of spheres, spherical looking things. Those are spores. All right. So they can produce a lot of spores. A lot. So they're famous for that. Some of you who have allergies, that may be exactly what you're allergic to. It's the surface proteins on the spores that might be triggering allergies. Okay. So fungi can be hugely diverse in what they look like. And so you're probably pretty familiar with mushrooms. And so the kind of fancier term, we could say fruiting body. Mushrooms are fruiting bodies. And so fruiting bodies, that's an old botany term, but it still sticks. We still use that a lot in science. And so mushrooms, when you see them, there's a lot of mushrooms out right now. We've had enough rain this summer where there's a lot of different mushrooms out here. Right now, Dr. Robertus is teaching a mushroom class, mycology, called field mycology, where they go out, hunt down these mushrooms and bring them back. It's a fun class if anyone wants to learn more about fungi. And so if you see these fungi, basically you know they've had sex because that's their version of getting their spores after sex dispersed. And so what they're doing is underground, all those hyphae, they're meeting up and having their version of sex where they exchange genetic material. They don't have sperm and egg, but they can still have their chromosomes, combining. And then they'll form these mushrooms, which is just fungal hyphae. When you eat a mushroom, you're eating fungal hyphae. It's just fungal hyphae that's been compressed very tightly to make that mushroom shape. And then some part of the fruiting body or the mushroom has spores that have been made through sexual reproduction. So when you're out hiking around, you see mushrooms, think about sex. That's what's been going on. Okay, they've been having their version of sex. And so those spores, most fruiting bodies come up out of the ground because they want the air currents to take the spores, right? And disperse them out and get them into new habitats. Fungi also can form partnerships with other organisms. And so if you looked at lichens on rocks or concrete or on the tree trunk of a tree, we have lichens all over the place here, which is a good thing. That means we don't have much air pollution. And so there's lichens all over the place, and fungi are part of that relationship. And so they can form partnerships. So lichens are fungi and algae hanging out together, or fungi and cyanobacteria. And so lichens are incredibly interesting organisms. You grow them separately. You grow the fungus and the algae separately, and they look nothing like the lichen. So when they come together to form a physical relationship with each other, they look so different. And it's really quite amazing how they morph. Mycorrhizae, I'm going to talk a little bit more because they have a lot of applied uses when it comes to commercial crop production. And so mycorrhizae are a relationship between fungi and plants. Usually we're thinking about the plant roots. Okay, and so the fungi and the plant roots hang out. So I'm going to talk more about that. And then, of course, there's fungal pathogens that can attack plants. In fact, if you were to make a list of all the pathogens that attack plants, fungi win. There's more fungal pathogens out there than any other plant pathogen. More than viruses that attack plants or bacteria that attack plants. So fungi win. However, fungi, there's a lot of good fungi that hang out with plants that are absolutely critical. So fungi can be really, really helpful. All right, these 4 terms I'd like you to know. All right, so please commit these to memory. So these are different classes of fungi, right? And so when you look at a fungus, you can use certain features of those fungi to identify them and group them into these different classes. So there's zygomycete fungi, ascomycete, basidiomycete, and glomeromycete. Okay, there's some others, but these are the 4 I want you to know. Okay, so these are relevant in commercial fungal production when we think about how fungi interact with plants or how we use fungi directly in commercial applications. So I'm not going to go into the way we classify bacteria or fungi is often we look at their life cycle, and based on that, we can put them into these different groups. I'm not going to go into all their life cycles because there's a lot of different ways it gets quite deep very quickly. So I'm just going to say a few things. Okay. So one thing that you can say about zygomycete, you've probably interacted with them. You've eaten moldy bread. That's probably a zygomycete type fungus that you had the unlucky pleasure of biting into. And so if you take some bread, so on this lower right image, you see that kind of black, dusty look to the bread. That's this particular bread mold, they call it. And if you zoom into it, it forms these long hyphae that come up off the bread. And then all those black areas, that is where the spores are. If you crack that open, that's where the spores are. All right, so sporangium That's just a fancy word to say it's a part of the fungus that holds the spores. Okay. And then you can see the special hyphae that come up off the surface of the bread in this case. But again, it's just hypogrowth, and then they usually stick their spores in a special like sac at the top of the hyphae. So zygomycetes tend to look like that under the microscope. Ascomycetes, you're probably most familiar with some classic examples of ascomycetes. On the left, you're seeing truffles, truffle fruiting bodies. Okay, these actually stay underground. They never come up out of the surface of the soil. These are the ones that historically they used to use pigs. They trained pigs to sniff them out because apparently truffles give off an odor that smells like a female pig in heat. So they used male pigs to go find these, and they would dig them up. Now they've trained dogs to do this because if you train a dog to the right scent, they can find this too. So it's cheaper to do dogs, and dogs are more obedient and less likely to fight you when you take them away from the truffles. Well, the pigs can get quite ornery about it. So does anyone know what the right image might be? What? Morel. Yeah, morel fungi. Very well prized fungus to eat. Very expensive. There's morels around here. But anytime someone will say, oh yeah, I found some morels, and I'll say, oh yeah, where? And they quickly shut up because people don't like to talk about their morel patches because they're so highly prized and there's not very many of them. And so once you stumble on a patch, you don't want to tell. It's like the fishing hole. You don't want to tell where you caught that big fish. So it's the same thing if you go morel hunting. We don't have truffles around here as far as I know, but morels, yeah. Okay, so those are some famous examples, but I'm not going to get into the life cycles of them. Basidiomycetes, I'll probably talk a little bit more about because they're more heavily used in applied uses, but I'm still won't get into their life cycle in any detail. But they're the ones that when you are looking at mushrooms around here, it's highly likely it's a basidiomycete that you're looking at. Okay, it's a fungus that belongs into that class. And so you can have some really deadly basidiomycetes. So Dr. Robertus, who teaches field mycology, he'll be the first to tell you not to eat anything that you collect unless you are absolutely sure what it is. And so Amanita is being shown here in this image that can kill you if you eat enough of it. It could kill your dog, it could kill your young child. All right, so the smaller your body mass, the more deadly it can be because it wouldn't take as much to kill you. So very, very poisonous, Amanita. There's several species within Amanita, that genus, that can kill you. But on the other hand, there's plenty of basidiomycetes that are incredibly useful. Like there's certain types of basidiomycete species that are considered mycorrhizal fungi. They form a relationship called ectomycorrhizae, which I'll talk more about in part 2. Ectomycorrhizae, that word just means it's a fungus that hangs out with plant roots in a symbiotic relationship. All right, so I'll talk more about ectomycorrhizae later. And then there's plenty of edible fungi out there as long as you know what you're doing. Okay, so for example, portobello mushrooms, which you can find in grocery stores around here, no problem. There's the baby portobello, the bigger portobellos that that you can grill on the grill and cook like a meat patty, like a hamburger meat patty. Those are portobellos too. They're just grown for longer periods of time. Shiitake, one of my favorites, shiitake mushrooms have been really well studied for their beneficial nutrient profile. And a lot has to do also, they think they're medicinal, like there's many medicinal uses of shiitake too. And there's other mushrooms that are getting studied like lion's mane that are incredibly promising for medicinal purposes again. In fact, they did one study that made it seem they need to do more research, but it sounds like they're thinking lion's mane can actually help promote nerve growth in brains. And so they're saying it can have nerve regenerative properties. So they're working on that. So that's just a really small list. There's way more out there. But again, you really got to know what you're doing. We have edible mushrooms in this area, but you really have to know what you're doing because there's a lot of poisonous ones in this area too that look similar to the edible ones. So you really have to be careful. Tomorrow in lab, we are providing you with mushroom kits that came from a company in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Their son actually went to Northern and graduated from this. I like to give them our business. But they will provide kits of certain edible fungi. So I'm very confident when we grow those, we're getting the real deal that we can eat safely if you choose to do that. Okay. So we're giving you a safe way to try this. We're not going to make you go forage and figure it out. But there are lots of options, and it's getting bigger and bigger. There's more companies out there that are getting into fungal production and mushroom production. So there's all kinds of different mushrooms out there that look very different from each other, but they all belong into the Basidiomycete group. So on the left, those are the puffballs. You might have had fun with those when you were younger, or maybe you still do, like I do. My word of caution, if you want to poke them to make them puff up the spores, don't stand downwind of them. Stand away from them and don't inhale the spores. Do not inhale. All right. I know it's irresistible. When I used to go hiking with my sons when they were younger, it was irresistible. So I'd give them a long stick and we'd have to figure out which way the wind is going. And once we got that all figured out and were situated appropriately, I let them go at it. But the reason I'm making a deal about this is that there was a case study done, well, two, where a group of high school students thought that inhaling spores would make them hallucinate. And that's not true with these. And then another case study where a person got fungal spores into their lungs and the fungus started growing in their lungs, like colonizing their lungs. And so they had to go in and surgically remove. So really kind of scary. So be careful about that. No inhalation. And then here you see bracket fungi, so to speak, growing on tree trunks. So again, this isn't, some people say, oh, my tree's going to die. No, not necessarily. I mean, maybe it's at the very end of the tree's life. Yes, but just because you see this doesn't mean your tree is being attacked or going to die. So again, this is just to show you the beauty and diversity. Mushrooms are fascinating to look at and so different from each other. And you can find most of these around here, although I haven't seen the bottom right one. I don't know if anyone else has. That's the veiled stinkhorn. Lovely name. But all these others you can find around here. So the top one, that's a chanterelle, which is edible. Tastes like a fruit. Does anyone know chanterelles taste like apricot? Yes, thank you, apricot. So, and then one of Dr. Roberta's students just recently got her master's working with chaga. You might have heard of chaga mushrooms, and they also are getting quite a reputation for medicinal purposes. People put like chaga extract in their coffee and, or just put it under the tongue and use it that way. And let's see, the problem is chaga grows on tree trunks. I don't think they know how to grow it yet commercially. So they harvest it, but they're over harvesting it. And so she did a thesis project trying to figure out what does chaga like in order to flourish in different forests, like what kind of forest, what kind of trees. And so she did a lot of work on that because, from her perspective, she's concerned about it going to extinction. So it's like, if we can figure out what it likes, maybe that can help preserve and maybe we can take that and grow it commercially. And so she did a really nice study. And you can find chaga in this area. She did all the research here in this area. So she did a really good job with that. So, okay. Another group that I wanted to mention are the glomeromycetes, that class. So these are the ones where a lot of mycorrhizal fungi, so to speak, exist into this group. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this in part 2, but I wanted to just, tell you where they belong. So this glomeromycete category, this class. So when we say obligate, we mean that these fungi can't um, exist for any length of time separate from the plant. They're in such a close relationship that if you try to separate them and grow them separately, the fungus doesn't make it. They die off. So these are the big long words that we give these fungi. And it depends who you're talking to or what you're reading. They're called different things, unfortunately. They all mean the same thing, though. So arbuscular mycorrhizae, they often get abbreviated down to AM, also known as vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae, big long words. And if that gets abbreviated, it's VAM, which we often just say VAM, and then endomycorrhizae. So all those long terms they mean the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. It's just over the decades here, people have been using slightly different names. And it's confusing. But basically, all of these, the more popular term seems to be this, currently is arbuscular mycorrhizae. So I'll try to use that. So these arbuscular mycorrhizae, they form really intimate growth connections with plant roots. All right. And probably the most heavily studied is this fungus. This is the genus name, Glomus. Some people might say Glomus. I say Glomus. Okay. Glomus, that fungal species, is probably one of the most well studied arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And so far, anyways, there's more species in Glomus than any others that we know of. So it's a really large group. Most of them, well, could they do it in like natural systems, like in agricultural systems? You could keep the plants alive, but in like they're all out on their own without our help. Probably not. They probably make it for a while, but probably end up dying. So it's a real tight relationship, and it's a win-win. Like the fungus gets a lot of help from the plant, but so does the plant get a ton of help from the fungus. So it's they're helping each other out. So this is some visual images of the glomeromycetes. So the reason they give them these huge long terms, the arbuscular mycorrhizae, is that when you look at them, okay, so what you're seeing in the top right is a plant root that's been cut longitudinally, and now you're looking at some individual plant cells. And if the fungus is associating with this plant root, they can form these arbuscules is what it's called. This lower right image is an arbuscle. Especially that lower right image, doesn't that look like a little shrub or tree? So if you look up the word arbuscle, it means dwarf tree. So that's why they gave it that weird term. Arbuscle means dwarf tree because that's what these structures look like. But it's just a bunch of fungal hyphae. That's all it is. It's just fungal hyphae that's morphed into this weird looking structure. And then the vesicular idea, I said sometimes they're called vesicular arbuscular, this lower section of the purple picture here, that's a vesicle. A vesicle in science, when we say vesicle, it's just like a balloon-like structure. And so that's fungal hyphae that's just kind of plumped up into like the shape of a balloon. And so they give the term vesicular. So that's why you get those weird long terms that people use to describe. And then you're seeing a drawing of how the fungi is really intersected with the plant root. Okay, really close physical connection. So I'll talk a little bit more about mycorrhizal fungi in part 2. This is a former student working in the greenhouse. I love the back of his shirt. And you probably don't remember the Got Milk commercials, although I think they made a bit of a comeback recently. So this was a takeoff or a play on words, got mold instead of got milk. So Kevin's working in the greenhouse. So just wanted to say a couple of things. When we look at the plants that are used commercially, all of those so-called terrestrial plants, when they say how do they evolve? Most scientists would say green algae. Green algae were the ancestors. However, this other word, charophyte, so charophytes used to belong to the green algae group, and then they decided, no, they belong in their own separate group. I'm okay if you just say green algae because really they're so closely related. Let's just say green algae for now because they're arguing about it right now, and the story is still to be determined. So let's go with green algae. Green algae, they think, were the ancestors to the terrestrial plant. However, fungi were really, really important. If you think about, okay, so green algae, most green algae are in water, either fresh water or the ocean. They think what happened was the green algae in the ocean, you had this migration on the land. Can you imagine if you are an organism trying to shift from living in the ocean to living on land and making that huge shift and then surviving that? That's phenomenal. And so this idea of how in the world did we get terrestrial plants from their ancestor green algae in the ocean? And so that has been really intensely studied, lots of debate. But what they are finding is that about 500 million years ago, MYA, million years ago, what they find is that fungi were there to help this process out. And in fact, what you're seeing in this bottom right, where it says presence of 3 mycorrhizal genes, what they realize is that certain algae actually have on their chromosome these genes that can be used to form a relationship with fungi. So they were already like ready to go. So by the time you had them splashing on the land, they were already equipped to hang out with fungi. And so they kind of came preloaded, ready to go for I can hang out with fungi. If I can just get on the land and make it long enough for a fungi to come along and help me, I can do it. I mean, but still, can you imagine how many times that failed before it finally, happened where the algae ancestor or the terrestrial ancestor and the fungus got together. So it's kind of mind-boggling, but really they say mycorrhizal fungi. We're thinking about mycorrhizal fungi because they're the ones that form such an intimate relationship with plants. And so they think now they're pretty confident that roughly 500 million years ago, fungi were there to help plants establish. So if it wasn't for these fungi, it would have, who knows what the earth would have looked like in terms of plant life. So you don't need to know those two words really. They are finally starting to nail down though, like what type of fungi were actually there. And it's the Mucoromycotina and Agglomyromycotina. You don't need to memorize those. Okay. Just know that we're thinking about mycorrhizal fungi assisted this transition, this most amazing transition from ocean to land. Okay. So mycorrhizal fungi, I'll talk a little bit more about. I have a real soft spot for them because part of my PhD thesis I worked with mycorrhizal fungi, and so they're a fascinating group. So when you look at all the plants that are just in the environment or commercially grown, about 85% of plants are forming this relationship of some sort, some kind of mycorrhizal relationship. And they know there's different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi. So like the AM are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So most plants form that kind of relationship with these types of fungi. But orchids they're kind of their own special, they have their own special fungi that hang out with them. And so they call them orchid mycorrhizal fungi. And they're fascinating. One of my former grads, well, Carrie, she started looking at orchid mycorrhizae and then kind of switched into endophyte. And then ectomycorrhizae are the group I worked with because they're the easiest to grow in a research lab. They're really easy to work with, relatively speaking. But really only about 2% of the plants hang out with ectomycorrhizal fungi. And then there's another group that are pretty well studied called ericoid. So there's certain plants that are called ericaceous plants. We'll get, I'll mention that in part 2. But so different groups of mycorrhizal fungi. And this isn't an exhaustive, there's others out there. All right. But I just wanted to get you thinking. And then this pie chart, I think, is a nice visual because it's showing that the vast majority are the arbuscular mycorrhizae. So most of the plants that you will interact with in your life, if they do have mycorrhizal relationships, it's the arbuscular mycorrhizae. Okay? But when you're out hiking around or walking around on campus, all the trees around here, trees are famous for hanging out with ectomycorrhizae. So trees and shrubs, they really like the ectomycorrhizae. They partner up with them. Okay. All right. So you're going to look at algae tomorrow in lab. Let me just show you a couple of pictures. We're still in the eukaryotic world. So fungi are eukaryotic. Algae are eukaryotic. Plants are eukaryotic. All right. So we're humans, we're eukaryotic. So they have that kind of cell type. Okay. The algae, when you look at all the algae out there, oh my gosh, it's so diverse. So we're scratching the surface and we're really going to focus on only a couple of groups of algae. Probably the heaviest emphasis will be green algae, which we do have a lot around here in freshwater. But you're going to look at some live samples of green algae under the microscope and with the naked eye or hand lens. So we're not getting into much of like their life cycles because, oh, yikes, it's really diverse. Like how they go through their life cycle, there's all kinds of strategies and we just don't have time. So we're not going to do that. That's not what this class is for. However, I want you to think about their like growth form, like their morphology. What are some differences? So I want you to know that algae can be single celled, which is that type of top right image. They can just be single cells, living by themselves like that. However, they can be colonial. So you can have a bunch of single cells all kind of mushed together, and they often have some kind of slimy or gelatinous covering that sticks them together. So then we say they're colonial. So that middle image is giving you some examples of that. And then some can be filamentous, where you have definite long strands of the algae body. All right. So we have all of that around here in this area. If you're from one of the coasts, you might be familiar with kelps, and that's the last one I want you to think about in terms of body morphology. And so they can be huge. If you've ever gone scuba diving in a kelp forest, I've not done that, but that would be something I would love to do because it just looks so incredible. So I just wanted to, sometimes they talk about them like they're a plant, like they give plant names or, like roots, but they're not really roots. So I'd like you to know the real word, holdfast, is the word, because they're not true roots. So holdfast, the stem is often referred to as the stipe or stalk. And then the leaves, the so-called leaves, really it's more appropriate to call them blades. And then they have bladders, which are filled with air to keep their leaves, floating and closer to the sun if they're underwater. All right. So kelps are kind of a unique, they're more complicated. All right. So tomorrow in lab, you're going to look at some algae and then do some experiments with certain algae to think about some of their applied uses. Okay.